Hello everyone, good morning. Since this is our very first live stream, I was wondering if you could let me know if the streaming is working on your side. So if you can hear this and you can see the screen, then please type into the chat box that that you can hear me and you can see the presentation. Okay, perfect. So let's begin. Once again, welcome to the live stream. The virus is really kind of making us all stay at home, but today we're going to try something new at Basic Income Ireland, and we decided to live stream our presentation instead of a physical meeting. If this works well, then in future we might consider doing online meetings so that our members from outside Dublin can participate more easily as well. So with that, let's dive into the presentation. So if you have any questions or comments, then feel free to type them into the chat box, and our moderator, John Baker, will be happy to answer some of your questions. And if he sees that the question is directly relevant to the presentation, then I will be highlighting them after the main part. And during the discussion, I will try and respond to as many questions as possible. So today we're going to talk about basic income experiments, and specifically we are going to talk about a possibility of a trial in Ireland. So why did we choose this topic today? Well, the context here is that in Ireland there were the elections last month, and the Green Party and Fianna Fáil actually included a basic income trial or a basic income commission in their respective manifestos. And of course, Basic Income Ireland picked it up. We published it. We published the text of the manifestos on our website, and basically, we are very much looking forward to potentially help and facilitate these moves, which we find very welcoming. So support for basic income in Ireland, as well as support for basic income around the world, is very much growing, and we think that this is a very timely moment for us to start talking about experiments. So before we go into particular experiments, let's just look at some definitions. So one big challenge for basic income experiments is that a lot of different countries look at basic income and kind of come up with their own definition and sort of implement an experiment without really thinking about whether the cash transfer that they are introducing into the experiment is consistent with the idea of basic income. So it's very important that we are all on the same page with regard to what counts as basic income, as well as what counts as a basic income experiment, which in this presentation I will refer to as UBI experiments. So first of all, I'm going to suggest that the minimal definition of a universal basic income that it's an universal, unconditional, periodic cash transfer. So you might look at this definition and go, hold on, I don't see certain criteria that I find relevant to basic income. Well, if that's your reaction, then that's very healthy, and that's okay. So there are a couple of important things to note about this definition. The first thing is that, a number of quite common criteria are not included. So one that's very common is individuality. So a lot of basic income advocates maintain that basic income should be a payment to individuals rather than households. And there are some very good arguments for why we should be paying to individuals rather than households. However, here we're looking at a minimal definition, and individuality is not necessarily part of the minimal definition. So there can be some contexts in which paying the basic income to households will perfectly kind of suffice as a cash transfer to count as basic income. Also, different countries are at different stages of their economic development, and then also different countries have different forms of government and bureaucracy and administration. So sometimes it's simply easier if basic income is administered to households rather than individuals. So again, I find that it's better to stay open on whether it should be individual or household. The other big item that's kind of excluded from this definition is substantiality. So the idea is that universal basic income is only really a universal basic income if you can live on it frugally but decently. And again, this is one approach for sure, but different people have different ideas of what counts as a success condition for a universal basic income. So of course, advocates such as Martin Luther King and so forth, they advocate for a human rights approach, which states that basic income is success just in case it lifts everybody off above the poverty line and makes sure that the right to life is guaranteed for all. But that's not the only approach. Others suggest that basic income is good because, for example, it helps economic development by injecting stimulus into the economy. And in those cases, the amount can be somewhat smaller compared to the human rights approach. And also, what counts as substantial is quite ambiguous. And here I would suggest that the amount that is adequate is itself an empirical question. So with these caveats, let's move on to the second definition, which is UBI experiment. So in this presentation, I will assume that a program or experiment that replicates a cash transfer, which satisfies the definition of universal basic income, is a UBI experiment. So in other words, if the cash transfer in the experiment fails to be universal, unconditional, periodic, and cash, then basically that experiment is not a UBI experiment. And we will see later that a lot of so-called UBI experiments are actually not UBI experiment proper. Again, a caveat here is that many experiments will administer a basic income by selecting low-income population groups, and we will make an exception here and allow that conditionality to affect the experiment, because if we exclude those experiments, then we're pretty much left with nothing. And it is an open question as to whether we could do an experiment where we don't control for the income level of the population. So again, if you have any views on that, then feel free to let us know in the chat box. Okay, so let's now move on to real experiments. So I'm going to show you 10 or maybe 10, 11 basic income experiments that actually happened and are of quite significance. So all of those experiments are listed in a recently published World Bank report, which I will link into in the comments after this presentation so that you can take a look. So the first experiment we're going to look at is Mongolia. So Mongolia had a service called Mongolian government had a service called the Universal Child Grant, which basically was a cash transfer for every household for every child they had, and it was meant to assist people who wanted to start and sustain families. In 2010, however, there was some political unrest as people demanded that the Mongolian government spend their mining wealth democratically rather than appropriate the wealth for a select few. And eventually the Mongolian government responded to this by introducing a full basic income program in Mongolia from 2010 to 2012. This was quite a radical move, and it's probably the most kind of promising example of a basic income program introduced at a national level. And this cash transfer again satisfies all the requirements of a basic income. So the next program is in Iran, and my understanding is that it is an ongoing program. However, if you know anything about this, if you've seen anything in the news that says it's terminated or modified, then let me know. But my understanding is that since 2011 in Iran, after the subsidy reform, basically the Iranian government introduced a national opt-in program open to all Iranian nationals. And eventually 96% of the Iranian population applied for a basic income and started receiving the cash transfer. And again, this is based on Iran's oil wealth, and it was introduced as a way to fairly distribute the gains from the oil wealth. And finally, there's the case of the Macau Special Administrative Region in China. And Macau had a program called the Wealth Partaking Program. It still has it in place. And the idea of the Wealth Partaking Program is basically a national dividend. So every year, Macau will account for the economic growth that's happening in the region, and whatever surplus is being distributed to its population fairly and equally. So that functions as a basic income, although it is somehow lower compared to certain other programs. So these three represent kind of a national level or regional administrative level experiment of basic income. Let's move on to smaller scale experiments. So sorry about that. So the first one we're going to look at is the Give Directly program in Kenya. So Give Directly is a charity group and a research group started by two young men in America. And basically the idea is that Kenya is one of the poorest countries in the world, and a lot of people there live below the international poverty line. So initially Give Directly was about alleviating poverty, but instead of providing goods, the founders of Give Directly decided to provide cash transfers. So now whenever somebody donates to Give Directly, basically the Give Directly organization gives about 80% to 90% of the donation directly to the people who are participating in Kenya. What's amazing about this program is that the transfer amount is 50% of the international poverty line. So in other words, it covers 50% of what basically each and every Kenyan is entitled to as a human right. And basically the recipients are randomly selected through a rigorous process. Also, we should note that this is a randomized control trial at a community level, meaning that the randomization process not only selects for individuals, but also selects for communities. So we can actually compare communities and observe community effects, which is a huge advantage in an experiment. And finally, they do both lump sum and periodic transfers. And again, we can debate whether the lump sum counts as a basic income. However, the periodic transfer definitely seems to count. And as long as the donations are coming in, this program will continue, hopefully. And they have a dedicated website with scholars participating. Most notably, recent Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee is part of the Give Directly program, and the research is well documented on an ongoing basis. The second community level RCT is the Madhya Pradesh study in India. Again, Madhya Pradesh is one of the poorest villages in India, and it was selected primarily for kind of humanitarian reasons. So this program was initially run by SEWA, and 30% of the local poverty line was the amount of the basic income given. Again, there was a rigorous randomization process where 8 treatment villages were selected, and as well as 12 control villages. Each village has a fairly homogeneous population with about 100 inhabitants each. There is a book on this experiment called Transformative Policy for India, published in 2015. So I really encourage you to take a look at that book if you're interested in what the experiment looked like. But let's say that it was quite a success, and a number of interesting empirical findings were gained from this experiment. So moving on to other experiments, the next one we're going to look at is Seed Stockton. So this is an experiment that's again ongoing in Stockton, California. It's smaller in scale compared to what we've been looking at so far, but about 500 randomly sampled individuals who are below the median income were assigned to either the treatment group or one of 3 control groups. So that means that in the end, around 125 people were receiving the basic income like cash transfer. It's monitored on an ongoing basis, and again, I will link the experimental design document in the comments below. Another ongoing experiment is the Be Minkum project. So this project is going on in Barcelona, Spain, and they have a dedicated blog documenting its progress. I guess what's interesting about Be Minkum and Stockton is that compared to the other experiments we've looked at, they're potentially more applicable to the Irish context, simply because in terms of economic development, cultural and historical context, geographical location, and so forth, these regions are much closer to Ireland, and therefore whatever findings we get from these experiments could have external validity for Ireland. The only downside is that these experiments administer the cash transfer on an individual basis instead of testing for a community level effect, and this could potentially be a huge problem, and this is something that Irish experiments could mitigate by actually giving basic income to a community instead of individuals. So the last experiment in this vein is the Namibia Basic Income Grant. So this was one of the first and probably the pioneering examples of basic income experiment. Here we will link the document in the comments, but it's fairly well documented, and the cash transfer was given to select to the entire village of Ocho. Sorry, I can't pronounce the village name, but the entire village basically received basic income. So about 900 plus villagers received a basic income grant. And what's interesting here is that the experimenters note in the document that they found randomized control trials to be unethical in the context of Namibia. So they just decided to select one village and give this basic income guarantee to all of the villagers. So this is an example where a whole community receives basic income. So it's essentially a saturation site where the spillover effects of a basic income grant is fully kind of saturated within a given region. So this is a saturation size study. It's excellent to monitor the community effects. So what basic income can do for a community as opposed to mere individuals. The only downside of the Namibia Big is that the experiment was not a randomized control trial, meaning that there was no control group to compare the Namibia Big recipients to. So those are the experiments where the cash transfer actually satisfies the basic income definition. However, there are some borderline cases. So we're going to look at 3 borderline cases. And the reason why they're borderline is because either they're commonly taken to be a basic income experiment, but actually has kind of a shortcoming in terms of whether it satisfies the cash transfer, the basic income experiment, or the cash transfer seems to satisfy the basic income experiment, but the program itself was rather sporadically designed, or in some cases not designed at all. So the first example is the Minkum program in Dauphin, Manitoba. So this again is treated as one of the classical cases of a basic income experiment. However, if you look at the documentation, which was recently kind of compiled by Evelyn Forget, um, it actually is clear that the Manitoba Minkum program is more of a negative income tax experiment than a basic income proper. And the reason is that what happened in Dauphin was that the the government basically defined an income threshold for all the recipients, and if a recipient decided to work and earn money and go over that threshold, then taxation will kick in. And basically, the taxation won't take the form of deduction from income, but it was more like a reduction in the amount you were getting as a basic income. So the basic income could actually be reduced up to 50% depending on your income level in Dauphin. This makes it problematic because the idea of basic income is that it's unconditional. So if you're going to have your basic income reduced because you're working, then that means that the full amount is conditional upon your not working, which basically reproduces all the problems that are associated with traditional conditional welfare payments. So again, Mincome is touted as a basic income experiment, but I personally think that it's pretty clear that it's a negative income tax experiment and therefore should not be counted as a UBI experiment. However, since the literature treats this as such a classical case, I think it merits some discussion as before deciding to say that it's not a proper experiment. The second case is the Cherokee so-called casino dividend. So this is an example that is often cited in the United States context. And the idea here is that the Cherokee tribe basically started giving this dividend to its tribe members in a region where they were already conducting a field study for a different variable in social science. I think it was the mental health of children. And the Cherokee dividend was introduced. So inadvertently, the study on the mental health of children turned into a study of the effect of the casino dividend on the mental health of children. The problem with this case is that, first of all, the basic income guarantee is selected according to tribe membership, and the grant wasn't administered through a randomized control trial or a saturation site study. And finally, the experiment itself didn't really involve detailed planning. So this was a classical case where basic income was sporadically introduced, but there were no kind of intention to test its effects. Therefore, there was no properly designed experiment. So this is a borderline case. If there is a way to study this case in a rigorous way without depending on an experimental design, then I think we can be safe to call it a basic income experiment. But as things stand, I think this is a borderline case. So finally, there's the case of the Alaska Petroleum dividend. So this is probably one of the most famous cases in terms of it's been popularized by former presidential candidate Andrew Yang. So Alaska Dividend has been in place for around almost 40 years. And the idea is that since Alaska has a lot of petroleum wealth, the government had a choice between increasing government spending on programs or giving the petroleum wealth directly to the Alaska residents. And the government chose the latter. The problem with the Alaska dividend is that, first of all, again, as with the Cherokee dividend, the transfer wasn't really monitored in a rigorous experimental setting. But probably, kind of more importantly, the amount is around $1,000 to $2,000 a month. $1,000 to $2,000 a year, which means in some cases less than $100 a month. That's less than 10% of the United States federal poverty line. And it's kind of problematic to call that a substantial amount. It might count as a very mild stimulus. Maybe you might spend that money on a trip, or maybe a night out, or some extra books, or whatever else. But really, I mean, you can't meaningfully kind of build your life on a transfer of $80 to $100, and it's not clear how transforming that is. Some studies claim that Alaskans are better off getting that dividend in a measurable way, but it's I think it's open for debate, to say the least, as to whether this should count as a basic income. Okay, so there are many other experiments which purport to be basic income experiments but are not. And here's the list. I won't go through every single item, since it will take all day, but let's just note here that the media have been reporting pretty much all of those as a basic income trial. The problem is that the cash transfer in each and every one of those fails to satisfy even a minimal definition of basic income. And we'll come back to this problem later. So again, at this point, if you have questions regarding specific experiments, then feel free to type them in to the chat box. In the meantime, let's move on to some of the challenges that future basic income experiments need to address. So the first challenge is the problem of public miscommunication. So when an experiment is conducted, basically the experimenters, even if the experimenters design the experiment as carefully as possible, not every journalist reads the original source carefully and makes an effort to represent it. Rather, basic income is considered a highly controversial and radical policy in many contexts. So journalists are more than happy to just make sweeping statements in the headlines, and then the public gets the impression that what the journalist is claiming is in fact what the experiment showed. So a classic example of this is the Finnish experiment, where Finland's government, in relation to Kela, its internal job seeker benefit service, basically they conducted a basic income experiment targeting unemployed Finnish citizens who were receiving a job seeker benefit or an unemployment benefit. The problem was that the initial experimental design was modified quite significantly on the way, and also there were new rules introduced which allowed basically for recipients of the basic income to apply for additional benefits. So they had an incentive to not work regardless of whether they were getting the basic income, and so on and so forth. I will again link the full report in the comments, but the upshot is that the media got really confused, and some outlets claimed that the experiment went on for 2 years and it was a properly basic income experiment. Others pointed out that the design changed in the middle, and so it was problematic to call it a basic income experiment. Still others claimed rather sensationalistically that the Finnish experiment was terminated because they found that the labor effect was so negative, which is not true. But all of these sporadic claims were made. And it's actually very difficult to avoid this problem, in the sense that media will always go for the sensationalizing angle. So how can we mitigate this problem? Well, the first step we can take is that policymakers can work with science journalists and organizations that help science journalism and try and follow the model of science journalism. So, for example, if you open the news section of the Nature magazine, you will see that the prose is quite accessible to someone who's probably had like a high school education, but the content is quite rigorous as well. It reflects as accurately as possible the actual finding that it's reporting on. Science journalists tend to be very, very mindful of the problem of miscommunication. So if policymakers would like to inform the public through experiments, then they should probably follow this model. The second is to minimize the nodes in the communication chain, as it were. So you might have heard of the miscommunication game, or what's sometimes called the Chinese whisper game. And the idea is that the more people there are between the experimenter and the consumer of the information, the higher the risk of miscommunication. So ideally, the experimenters might benefit from directly presenting their findings to the public on a national or kind of a large-scale media outlet. You can do a press conference, or you can organize even a live stream like this one, where people can ask experimenters the questions they have directly, rather than being mediated by media outlets and others who have a motivation to distort the findings. And finally, make sure to share a detailed report, and as well as any kind of presentation that has been done by the experimenters. Make sure to share them online so that people can access them easily and look at the primary sources themselves. The second problem with experiments is what's known as the Hawthorne Effect. The Hawthorne Effect states that people change their behavior depending on whether they know that they're observed or they think that they're not observed. So this graphic here basically shows an apple smiling because another apple is smiling at him or her, but he or she is secretly feeling quite low. So in terms of basic income experiments, this is quite significant because, I mean, imagine a group of Irish people received a basic income grant as part of a trial. They probably would feel really happy, and maybe some of them would feel like they have to broadcast how happy they are that and how great it is to receive this cash grant, and that everybody in Ireland should get it, and so on. So they might post things on social media and reference the grant, or I mean, even just kind of being aware that they're one of the first people to receive it might make them feel like, okay, so this grant is great, and not everyone is getting it. I'm very lucky to get it, but I want everybody to get it, so I'm going to improve my behavior. The Hawthorne effect generally kind of distorts individuals' behavior in a positive way, so people will act positively compared to how they would have actually acted if they were not observed. The Hawthorne effect is really, really difficult to control for, but there are several measures that we can take. So the first is to let the experimental subjects sign a non-disclosure agreement, meaning that they agree not to broadcast the cash payment to others. This will greatly reduce their incentive to advertise that they're on this program, and to a certain extent that might kind of control their behavior, in the sense that if they can't tell other people that they're getting the cash transfer, then what's the incentive to behave positively to reinforce that? The second mitigation technique is to consult case studies. So case studies of Hawthorne effects are kind of quite various and very interesting. A quick Google search or a quick internet search would return a lot of case studies. Again, really, really interesting to look at. And finally, make the experiments long-term in order to calibrate the treatment group. So what that means is that at first, when people get a basic income trial payment, they might get all excited and start experimenting with different things, or try to modify their behavior in a positive way. But the longer they get that payment, the more it becomes part of their day-to-day normal life, and the more likely experimenters can observe the effects of basic income in a normal context as opposed to an exceptional context. Okay, the last problem that we'll look at, and apologies for going slightly over time here, but the last problem here is the streetlight effect. So the streetlight effect states that in the context of UBI experiments, it states that policymakers might be biased towards looking at aspects of basic income that are easier to measure, simply because they're easier to measure in an experiment. So the joke here is that a man is asked by the policeman, "Are you looking for a wallet? There's nothing under the light," and the man answers by saying that I'm looking here because the light is brighter, but I lost the wallet in the park. So the joke is that the wallet is actually in the park, but because it's dark in the park, the man's not going to look in the dark. He's going to try and look in the light. So I mean, that kind of metaphorically captures the problem. So Carl Wiederquist, who's one of the leading scholars on basic income experiments, suggests in his recent book that the streetlight effect is actually the most difficult effect to mitigate in basic income experiments, simply because the effects that are difficult to measure in an experiment are really, really difficult to measure. So an example is the net beneficiary effect or the net contributor effect. So if you introduce an actual basic income, then presumably you're going to fund it through a combination of kind of national economic gains, maybe some additional quantitative easing or government stimulus, and some tax reformation. But it's going to be pretty clear that certain people will benefit more than others, and this difference could have an effect on the actual implementation. However, the differences in the amount of contribution a person makes or the amount of benefits a person gets is really, really difficult to reproduce in an experimental setting for ethical reasons and for technical reasons. I mean, imagine putting people in an experimental setting and then telling some of the people that we're going to take away your income just to see what the net contributor effect is. That could be highly unethical. And if the subjects knew that they're going to get the money back later, then that might distort the results. So that's just one example of an effect that's really difficult to test in an experiment. But that shouldn't mean that economic discussions and discussions around funding is somehow less important than, say, labor effect or mental health effects. Simply because labor effects and mental health effects are easier to test doesn't mean that they're more important or that we should be looking at that more in detail. So the way to mitigate this problem, firstly, is to start by asking what we want to know, not what we want to measure. And this will, to a certain extent, remove the bias that's created by thinking about, oh, but can we measure that? We should put that question on one side and first consider what we want to know. Secondly, it might help to make the policy research decisions independent of resource allocation. So what that means is that the group that decides on which questions are going to be researched is independent from the group that decides how the resource is going to be allocated. So this will potentially help mitigate this feeling that people might have if they were in charge of both resource and questions. They might feel that the question that they want to investigate doesn't have the sufficient resources, so that might discourage them from asking those questions. But if those questions are genuinely important for policy, then they should be encouraged, not discouraged, to ask those questions. So independence will help greatly in this regard. But again, as I said, and as Wiederquist points out, the streetlight effect is one of the toughest problems to solve for a basic income experiment. So I really encourage you to think about this a little bit deeper, maybe look into the literature on how this is treated. Although this problem itself is quite a recent development, so again, it's very much a blue ocean, a green field. So let us know what you think in the chat box if you have any good ideas on how to mitigate the streetlight effect. Okay, so far we've been looking at the challenges and potential solutions to basic income experiments. You've also seen that a lot of the experiments are conducted in contexts that are very different to our context in Ireland. So the question becomes, I mean, do experiments matter at all? Aren't we just better off introducing a basic income without conducting experiments? Now, there are non-epistemic problems with experiments too, which we haven't really looked at. So an example is it could have some political problems. So politicians have an incentive to say yes to a positive idea with the lowest cost possible. So if you present a politician with the option between conducting a trial and implementing a full basic income experiment, then a lot of politicians would be tempted to go for the trial simply because the political and economic costs of a trial is much lower than a full-blown basic income experiment. But what they get out of doing that is pretty much the same. So politicians can still say they support basic income without implementing a basic income program. The kicker here is that once you start a trial, then the politician is probably, there's a strong incentive to make it long-term as possible, because then during the trial, if somebody comes to that politician and says, look, this is the time to introduce a basic income program, politician can always counter by saying, we're currently running an experiment, so we are committed to doing this, but let's see how this pans out. So this is a perfect excuse for a politician not to introduce a basic income. And it's ironic because the excuse used is a trial, which is meant to encourage the implementation of a basic income. So that's quite a strong argument that's frequently presented within basic income circles. And again, it's a very challenging point to address, but I think we can mitigate these problems kind of by asking epistemic questions. So if an experiment is justified for epistemic reasons, then regardless of the political opportunism that might be going into it, it is still worth conducting that experiment. But if we know that there's no epistemic value to the experiment, so the design is flawed or it doesn't address some of the problems we've looked at, then we have strong grounds for calling out the opportunism and therefore actually increasing our chance of implementing a basic income. So epistemically speaking, without experiments, we end up with politicians engaged in poor planning. Basic income implementation becomes a matter of power politics and popular opinion, so populism. We have an electorate who's asked to potentially decide on a policy like basic income without having sufficient information as to whether it's empirically viable. We have decision makers who are making decisions based more on intuitions, models, assumptions, rather than empirical evidence, which biases the decision making. And finally, it's not. Personally, I think it's not that good an image for basic income as a whole, because if basic income advocates are saying we don't need to do experiments, that comes across as basic income advocates are dogmatic. They're not willing to test their ideas by putting it in practice in the real world. So we don't want basic income to become a dogma, and therefore it's actually better if we conduct experiments. If we conduct experiments, then the planning becomes more reliable, the political narrative becomes more rational, the electorate who is asked to participate in the decision making can look at the experiment and see for themselves what happens in the real world when it's introduced. The decision making process becomes much more impartial in the sense that facts don't care about our feelings. And finally, basic income becomes a more credible concept in the sense that people look at the experiment and go, wow, basic income is not just an abstract idea or a creed, it's actually a viable concept, and that's why basic income advocates are comfortable testing it in the real world. So it's actually really good for the movement to conduct properly designed experiments. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and apologies again for going over time. It's nearly 50 minutes, but I would like to now open it up for discussion. And again, thanks for listening to the presentation. Okay, I'm looking at some of your comments here. So again, if you have any questions, then feel free to type in your question and I'll be happy to address them. Also, some of the Basic Income Ireland moderators and regular members seem to be addressing your questions, which is great. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I'm still looking at the comments. Thanks for all the encouragements, and I'm very glad that the format is working. Thanks, Jichun. Thanks, Louis. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so Jichun is asking whether it's, well, his mother says that basic income is communism, but it's not communism because basic income is based on the voluntary wish of the people. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so Dave says, this is actually interesting. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry, Dave. I timed you out by mistake. Sorry about that. Okay, so Lucas asks, what would be the issues with a very small basic income for all just to get the people used to the idea, while trialing a more significant amount for, say, intercity Dublin? Okay, that's an interesting question, and yeah, so actually, this kind of goes back to the point of the amount being an empirical question itself, because let's look at Ireland, for example. So typically the amount that's suggested as a good amount that gives people kind of right to a dignified life is around 200 euros a week. However, there's no actual test done in Ireland that suggests that that's a sufficient amount or whether that's a required amount. I mean, you can think of scenarios where people are kind of receiving a modest income through other means like part-time work or selling their products. Just to kind of use my profession as an example, maybe a lot of people just stay at home and work on one-off projects and maybe sell books or sell a piece of software or a service. So there are many contexts where you don't really have to give the full amount to guarantee a decent life for all, even if they're not working in the traditional sense. So what amount counts as a meaningful basic income could be tested. So I agree with you. Maybe we could do even a randomized control trial where like one group gets the highest amount, so let's say the poverty line amount, and then another group gets a much smaller amount, and then maybe a third group that gets an intermediate amount, and see what the relative utility is for each. That's one idea. And again, apologies, Dave Quinn. I timed you out by mistake, and I think I deleted your comment by mistake. Yeah, apologies about that. Yeah, and so Dave was asking that since the time is quite limited at the moment, instead of an experiment, we want a policy that addresses the current crisis circumstances. And I agree that this is a very important moment for basic income advocates, and we should definitely kind of educate the public on, as well as policymakers and politicians, on how basic income could potentially alleviate the situation. But I think it's very important to also look at basic income as a long-term commitment. So, I mean, of course, we need some kind of unconditional cash transfer assistance for families around the country. But once the virus passes and things return to normal, the question becomes, okay, so is the government justified in withdrawing the cash transfers, since the original motivation was to alleviate the virus situation? And that's when it becomes very, very tricky for basic income advocates, because on the one hand, at that point, we would have pushed for a basic income based on a conditionality, basically, which is the spread of the virus. And since the conditionality is removed now, we don't have a justification for basic income. So we really can't push back to the government if they decide to discontinue the cash transfer because the virus situation was alleviated. So we need, I think, for a proper introduction of basic income in Ireland, we need epistemic justification for introducing it, and not merely a political justification or a contingent justification. So it's a challenge for sure to balance these two things, but yeah, let's see how to strike a good balance there. Yeah, so Paul Holden says, open door at the moment to roll it out nationwide. Lots of small businesses in danger of failing, lots of layoffs, need to support stay-at-home parents and partners of healthcare workers. Again, 100% agree. Some of my family members are family carers as well, and so I can really see why it could be beneficial. As somebody who's a freelance translator on a very precarious situation with very low income, I can see the temptation to just say, hey, let's just support, small businesses or just individuals right away instead of doing experiments. But I think, again, I would probably reiterate the point that I made regarding Dave's point, is that the policy has to be justified in a robust, kind of independent way in order to hold water in a long term. And the whole point of basic income is that it's periodic, that it's a fairly long-term commitment. So, for example, it should continue to be paid out even if nobody's struggling, because again, as we all like to point out, the point of a basic income is that it gives people the ability to say no to things that they don't they can't tolerate or they don't agree with. So again, introducing basic income because they're needy people implies that once these needy people are less needy or not needy, then basic income is not necessary, whereas it must be independent of people's needs. It must be an idea that is proven to work through empirical research, ideally. Welcome back, Dave, and sorry about that. I really just made a mistake there by clicking the timeout option. Okay, so Colette asking, what do you think of the Fianna Fáil and Green Party's proposal for basic income? So, yeah, I mean, feel free to chime in. The Fianna Fáil is actually not proposing a basic income per se. It's claiming that it's going to introduce a basic income commission. I'm just going to link you into our recent election page. It might go down soon, but so regarding Colette's, Yeah. So take a look at that page. We've basically just copied and pasted the parts of the manifestos from the Green Party and the Fianna Fáil Party that talk about basic income. As you can see, Green Party has a much more comprehensive and forward-looking approach. Fianna Fáil is more conservative, as you can expect. But actually, I think both are equally good in that they're both saying that, look, um, we would love to introduce something like this, but we want to kind of test the waters first before going full scale. And I think this is a very responsible approach. Um, I mean, I think it is a genuinely open question as to whether um, like a basic income guarantee is politically viable and economically viable in the European Union. I mean, we have to remember that since Ireland operates on the euro and is part of the eurozone, basic income in Ireland has rippling effects across other countries. So introducing a basic income in Ireland is actually a very, very political move in the European context. And we don't want other countries acting negatively or adversely towards us um, because they might perceive the basic income program as somehow like a free rider, or let's say. But if the decision to introduce basic income is based on a proper process where there's a commission established, there's proper research done, and there were findings that suggest that it's both viable and beneficial, then there's kind of objective reasons for the Irish government to push for basic income, and that would actually legitimate the so give legitimacy to the decision to introduce basic income, which would actually be very, very good in terms of European politics. So I think, I mean, the specifics of the proposal can be discussed further, and to be honest, I don't think any party in Ireland has a fully worked out basic income with a viable funding mechanism and mitigation of inflation and so on. But that discussion is definitely about to take place with these calls for a commission or trial. So I think the proper next step is to focus on how to build that justification in Ireland. But again, that's kind of my personal take on it, based on what I looked at in other countries. But you might have a very different view. Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Nice. I mean, one idea is for Cork City to consider doing a trial at a regional level. I mean, just like the city of Stockton in California, um, it could be an option. The good thing about smaller scale trials is that financially it's much more plausible, and how do you say, the quality of the experiment um, kind of to a certain extent it's compromised because the scale is lower, but since you can devote more resources to it, uh, you could potentially run a much more detailed experiment, and I think that's the approach of Stockton, California. Okay, so Leon says UBI for farmers instead of cap as an experiment. Um, yeah, this is actually a tricky point in that if you're selecting the recipients based on their occupation, then arguably that's already not a universal basic income. Because, I mean, if the farmer says, okay, I have a UBI now, so I'm just going to stop working, then they might lose the payment. Or maybe they want to, uh, change their career. Again, they can't really do that if it's conditional on their working as a farmer. Um, so my view is that, yeah, a UBI for farmers sounds great on paper, but it could be inconsistent with the definition of universal basic income. So, I mean, a payment for farmers is a payment for farmers. It's a conditional payment for farmers, and it's not a universal basic income. I mean, it doesn't give the ability to say no to the farmers. Okay. Okay. So, Eamon Maloney, could we frame Ireland as an EU experiment? Same island, two systems. Oh, I'm not too sure what you mean here, but I mean, are you suggesting that Ireland could be seen as a kind of a miniature version of the EU? So there's EU in the continent, and then EU on the island of Ireland. Yeah, I mean it's an interesting point. Like the interesting thing is that geographical connection is not that relevant for basic income. What's most relevant is the monetary connection. So as long as Ireland is part of the EU, um, it'll be politically challenging at a European level to introduce basic income in Ireland, or at least more challenging compared to other countries like the United States or China um, or like even Iceland, where they have a sovereign currency that's not connected to other economic regions. So yeah, I mean, I think I guess responding to your point about could we frame Ireland as a EU experiment, I guess the answer would be we just have no choice. Like it will be framed as an EU experiment if we did one. I mean, look at the example of Finland, for example. It wasn't a UBI experiment, but it was still, I mean, the kind of background context was, wow, finally somebody in the EU is testing it. So in that connection, also, it's really good to monitor the Barcelona case. So the Barcelona beam income is actually probably the most relevant experiment that's going on at the moment for Ireland, in the sense that it's as close as it gets to the Irish economic and cultural context. And it's also a very well designed and controlled experiment which satisfies the definition of a basic income. So yeah, let's look at Barcelona beam income and maybe build on that, or see what beam income is failing to cover and try and cover that or focus on that in Ireland. Okay, Anne asking, can you clarify the difference between trial and experiment? That's a good question, and to be honest, I don't really have a rigorous distinction here. Apologies for that. But I guess the difference would be the trial is it sounds more um, like a more accurate replication of basic income compared to an experiment. So an experiment can even be a lab experiment, for example, where somebody plays a computer game for an hour. Such experiments have been conducted, and it's very interesting. Like it returns some interesting results, whereas like you wouldn't call that a trial. So I guess experiments are kind of experiment. The word experiment encompasses more experiments, if I can put it that way, than trials. Yeah. Yeah, Colette, good point. And thank you for working so hard to get the costings through the party. Like, I totally agree with you. It is a challenging, it's a politically challenging concept to get through. Um, and yeah, I mean, as somebody who's very passionate about basic income, I have to say that the costing aspect is very, very difficult, and I can understand why people see it as too expensive. Um, I mean, when people say we can't afford it, what they might be saying is that based on my understanding of how it's going to be paid, we can't be afforded. It can't be afforded. So maybe the solution there is to present as many options as possible. I mean, I was considering adding a slide to this presentation looking at different funding mechanisms. But like even the funding mechanism actually changes the ideological context of the basic income grant a lot. For example, if you frame it as a dividend, which, for example, Andrew Yang and Yanis Varoufakis have been doing, then essentially you're removing the stigma completely, and you're not even presenting it as a welfare policy anymore. You're presenting it as an economic policy and, in fact, a right of citizenship. Like Andrew likes to say that we don't object to shareholders getting an annual dividend from Microsoft or Google. So why would people object to citizens getting an annual dividend from their government? That's a great way to frame it. It's business friendly, it goes down well, and it's very hard to argue against. I mean, if you're going to argue against a national dividend, then you have to argue against shareholder dividend as well, which is, I mean, obviously terrible for the economy. So that's just one example. But there are many different ways to fund a basic income. And maybe one way to test it is to actually go ahead and do an experiment comparing the different contributor and benefit effects of different funding mechanisms. So maybe you can have one group receiving the basic income based on income tax reform funding, and then another group receiving the basic income based on a dividend model. So you maybe measure the economic activity in the local community or the local businesses, and then calculate the annual earnings, and then maybe pay that out as a dividend, or part of that as a dividend, to the people living in that community. Another one is the stimulus model. So stimulus model works when a government's money, if a country's money supply and the demand that it creates is lower than the supply of goods. So the idea is that if you go into a shop and the shelves are filled with goods, but nobody has the money to buy them, then we have a situation where there's not enough aggregate demand, as Keynes would put it, and therefore we don't experience the economic prosperity and growth that we should be experiencing. So if that's the situation in certain communities, then simply the government simply printing the money and then giving the money to them will solve that problem, because now people have money in their hands to buy the goods, businesses will thrive, and people would generally be living a better quality life. And inflation doesn't happen in that scenario, because the goods are continually supplied at the same price and being sold at the same price, and consumers are still price sensitive. So yeah, for that to work, you need kind of a nice, a reliable method to monitor the supply, which is a challenge. You have to also forecast the effects of printing money and so on. But again, you can experiment that in a local scale. And I'm sure there are many other funding mechanisms that are not discussed here. Yeah, and I guess the other thing to keep in mind is that if you do experiments, you kind of overcome indoctrination, in the sense that you're not relying on people's ideological orientation to agree with you. You rely on people's good sense and the ability to critically evaluate facts, which pretty much everybody has, regardless of their ideological orientation. And I'm pretty sure that UBI stands up to empirical scrutiny, and it's really it's kind of ironic, because our experiments tended to be very, very lenient and loose. And that kind of creates the impression that UBI is not up to being tested rigorously. But if you introduce UBI in the context of rigorous experiments that is really setting out to show it doesn't work, and if the results are positive and it shows that it still works, then that boosts the credibility of UBI in a major way. Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. Test bed, demonstration. Yeah, that's good. Um, yeah, demonstration could. Yeah, however, demonstration could assume that it's viable, and I think the point of an experiment is to test whether it's viable. Um, but yeah, test bed sounds good. So again, like I think these terms kind of have a stronger assumption behind it, in that it already is shown to work, and the only question is, can we show other people, so demonstrate it, that it works. But I think there are genuine uncertainties, and depending on the design, maybe it might not work. But yeah, better to say pilot scheme, Paul says, the implication being that it would be rolled out more widely than the bugs are ironed out. Yeah, so again, that kind of presupposes that it is already viable, and I mean, we might think that it's viable, but like from a neutral kind of critical standpoint, there might be certain problems. Like, the traditional stereotypical objections are pretty bad. I mean, people will still work. Inflation won't probably happen, but there are kind of other more subtle questions like, which funding mechanism works best, or like, like, are there potential problems that we haven't seen that might be exacerbated by introducing a basic income? Yeah. Okay. Okay, very good. So I think I'm going to leave it at that in terms of the live stream, but please feel free to continue discussions. If there is any question that I didn't address, or that some of the members didn't address in the chat box, then please feel free to leave a comment. Once again, thanks for participating, and please give us a thumbs up, or click subscribe if you think this works. And hopefully the next time we do it, we will look at what worked, what didn't work in this stream, and do a better version of this. So thanks again, and have a nice weekend.